Today is Monday, October the 1st, and this is The Drill. Thank you. And this is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States of America, because I'm the only one that makes the presumption for the status quo. It occurred to me this morning about a good way of demonstrating the difference in approach between the left and the right. And because the left is very psychologistic and imaginary. That's the way they approach life. That's the way they approach the way that they are going to deal with the right, their strategy or tactics for dealing with the people on the right is, or even with people, their own people, is with imagination and psychologistic techniques, whereas the right is more intellectual. Well, it seems to me the best analogy for those two things is poker and chess. That when you're dealing with the left, you're dealing with poker and poker players, and when you're dealing with people on the right, you're dealing with chess players. You're dealing with people that are intellectual in nature, that acknowledge and respond to reality and rules and whatnot. So whereas poker is more about bluffing. And that's why I say that the left is, their MO basically is to bluff. And it reminded me of this because of an episode of Star Trek, the original series, in which the Enterprise was face to face with a ship that was about as big as a planet. It was unbelievably huge, and the whoever was on the ship was threatening to take the Enterprise in tow and take it back to their home planet and basically enslave the captain and his crew. And so Spock says to him, there's nothing we can do. It's, checkmate. It's a game of chess, checkmate. And then at that time, the captain says, no. He gets a flash, an idea, and he says, no, not chess, poker. And so then he proceeds to bluff the opponents into weakening their position, and he ends up saving the day and saving the crew. And Spock, I remember, says, you're going to have to teach me this game of poker, because it impressed him with how well it worked out by simply using bluffing techniques. But that's where I figured that's the perfect analogy for left and right, is the left likes to use, because they want to exert power. And poker is a game basically of power. It's a game of bluffing. It's a game of psychology, whereas chess is much more a game of intellect, of intelligence, and being able to make plans. Poker is also not only about bluffing, but about acting more impulsively, whereas chess is all about plans. The better you plan things out, the better you will fare. The more you have a tendency to be impulsive in chess, the more you have a tendency to lose. So today, I'm going to be reading from Tammy Bruce and David Horowitz, and I may see about maybe perhaps a little bit of Ayn Rand when we come back. Thank you very much, and welcome back. Today, I'm going to go ahead and do from the Ayn Rand lexicon, read something from the an entry from the Ayn Rand lexicon. And the word today is characterization. Characterization, or I should say actually not the word, but the concept. Because that's really what she's on about in this lexicon. It's not about words, it's about concepts. Words are arbitrary sensible signs with meanings imposed on them by convention, but concepts are not. Characterization. Characterization is the portrayal of those essential traits which form the unique, distinctive personality of an individual human being. Characterization requires an extreme degree of selectivity. A human being is the most complex entity on earth. A writer's task is to select the essentials out of that enormous complexity, then proceed to create an individual figure, endowing it with all the appropriate details down to the telling small touches needed to give it full reality. That figure has to be an abstraction, yet look like a concrete. It has to have the universality of an abstraction and, simultaneously, the unrepeatable uniqueness of a person. In real life, we have only two sources of information about the character of the people around us. We judge them by what they do and by what they say, particularly the first. Similarly, the characterization in a novel can be achieved only by two major means: action and dialogue. Descriptive passages dealing with a character's appearance, manner, etc. can contribute to a characterization. So can introspective passages dealing with a character's thoughts and feelings. So can the comments of other characters. But all these are merely auxiliary means, which are of no value without the two pillars, action and dialogue. To recreate the reality of a character, one must show what he does and what he says. So, and that's a little bit of a primer on writing, because Ayn Rand wrote a couple of books about writing. One was writing fiction, and the other one was about writing good nonfiction. So when we come back, it'll be time for Tammy Bruce. Thank you very much. And Tammy Bruce has written a book called The Death of Right and Wrong, and that's what I've been reading from. Just a second. And, of course, right and wrong is one of those things that cannot be created or destroyed. It may change its form. Technically, right and wrong remains the same. They're universal. Murder is wrong everywhere at all times for all people, period. And that doesn't change, no matter what. Now, what she's basically talking about is what is going to be fashionable in the future. What is going to be fashionable in the future, rather than right and wrong actually dying. The idea is it'll change. If we go to a socialist regime, we'll still have right and wrong. It'll just be that those rights and wrongs will be different than what we have now. So, but we're in the part of the book where she's been dealing with the four virtues and the four cardinal virtues, and now we're at a section called That Oppressive Decency. In my years working and sometimes living with activists and leaders in the left elite, I always found their hostility toward Christianity somewhat odd. I now recognize it as very revealing of the personal histories influencing our social activism. Many on the left describe themselves as recovering Catholics. They view the church as a parent who refuses to offer unconditional love. A disturbing common theme among feminists and gays, meanwhile, was that if the average person continued to view religion positively, it would mean, automatically, that feminists and gays were in trouble. The most threatening aspect of Christianity was its moral certitudes, which were the antithesis of the moral vacuum in which the left elite live. During my feminist activism, I entered into a religion of the left, a feminist and gay fundamentalism that viewed Christianity, decency, and morality as the enemy, the competitor, if you will, for the soul of America. Every special interest group needs an enemy. Feminists and gays found that enemy in Christianity. It's key to remember the importance of trauma, non-recovery, and narcissism when it comes to the mindset of the leftist leadership. With that perspective, it makes perfect sense that the left elite feel compelled to demonize and even destroy society's literal and figurative symbols of family and authority. And they do so, the left does, in part because that's communist dogma. That goes all the way back to Karl Marx. Even though this is a lot of what she's describing as part of the new left, the post-Marxist era, they still get most of their ideas from Karl Marx. And Karl Marx was saying that in order to get rid of capitalism, you have to undercut it and undercut the authority figures and institutions by subverting the culture of capitalism. And one of the cultures of capitalism is Christianity. What elephant? As the whole sordid story of sexual abuse by Catholic priests and the hierarchy's efforts to cover it up started to unfold, the New York Times appeared simply to be reporting the facts, although it reported them on the front page more often than the new developments in the cases might have warranted. Finally, however, the paper's apparent objectivity fell away in the form of an opinion piece by Bill Keller, a senior writer for the Times. Yes, Keller is just one individual, but he has an influential voice within the newspaper that sets the standard for how Americans, and indeed the world, are supposed to think about serious social issues. In fact, the coverage of this issue illustrates how few strategically placed individuals can form and guide the attitudes of the American intelligentsia, and by extension, of the average American. In his op-ed column of May 4, 2002, titled, "Is the Pope Catholic?" Keller begins by gloating over Pope John Paul's age and infirmity. Then he goes on to treat the church today as a parallel to Stalin's Soviet Union. Not a nice thing to do, and certainly meant to stir up feelings of immediate revulsion. Throughout the piece, Keller's cultural schizophrenia about the church comes through loud and clear. At one point, he writes that Vatican II created a more open and dynamic church. He then notes that at the time of Vatican II, the sexual revolution was right around the corner. However, he explains, the aging celibates in the church hierarchy couldn't reconcile themselves to equality of women, abortion on demand, and gay rights, which he implies has somehow contributed to the scandal of predatory priests. With this peculiar dance, Keller provides an excellent illustration of how those with the agenda of bashing Christianity and destroying the Catholic Church in particular have an uncanny ability to ignore the elephant in the room. The more open and dynamic church that Keller lauds did adapt to the changing mores of our society and did run smack dab into the sexual revolution. Too many priests did find just the wrong way of reconciling themselves to it. The institution may not have adapted to the feminist and gay civil rights movements, but the priesthood sure did. The result of that all that reconciling is what we're dealing with today. Predatory gay priests seducing adolescent boys. Ooh, look, an elephant. Ironic, isn't it? In the 60s and 70s, the church was condemned for not looking enough like us. So it changed, and now it is being condemned for looking like us. As we face that mirror, we're finding it's not such a pretty sight, and the church is finding out that damned if you do, damned if you don't, finding out what damned if you do and damned if you don't really means. In a later chapter, I'll deal in more detail with the problems of the Catholic Church and what it is facing, and with the role of the gay elite have played in the monstrous behavior of gay men with collars. The fact is that the ultimate goal of the left elite has never been to change the Catholic Church, it has been to destroy it. In one of his more bizarre comments, Keller contends that most Americans don't listen to the Pope about some of the more serious issues. He writes, quote, "It seems fair to say that a church that is not so estranged from its own members on subjects of sex and gender, a more collegial church would have handled the issue of child abuse earlier and better." Do you see the spin here? Keller, through his position as the New York Times, the paper of international record, placed the onus on the church as being estranged from its members, when in fact it's the members who are estranged from the church. Last time I checked, people of faith who wanted divorce and remarriage, abortion, sex out of wedlock, and homosexuality weren't estranged Catholics. They were called Protestants. Let me again point out to that elephant to Mr. Keller. If Catholics, and many American priests in particular, didn't ignore the Pope on these issues, they wouldn't have a child abuse scandal to deal with. How is it that in one breath you can bash the Pope for being dogmatic about issues of homosexuality, as an example, while complaining about the problem of, let's say it, homosexuals in the priesthood? Damn, that elephant keeps getting in the way. In the same op-ed piece, Mr. Keller confesses, "I'm what a friend calls a collapsed Catholic." Well, beyond lapsed. Surprise, he does not tell us why he hates the Pope or why he's a collapsed Catholic. Well, whatever the reasons, he's in a powerful position to further the agenda of the left elite. So let me find something here. Let me see. Let me see. Go on one. Oh, yes, this is what I was looking for here. In fact, the coverage of this issue illustrates how few strategically placed individuals can form and guide the attitudes of the American intelligentsia and, by extension, of the average American. And that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about shaping reality. He sees himself as a reality shaper. A lot of times, the news lately is not reporting what's going on. What they're really doing is they are making affirmations. They're putting in print what it is they want to happen, the way they want things to look, because they think that this is very powerful. That if they can get enough people around the country to agree with them on a particular issue and want the same things they want, that psychologically then they will start moving and becoming active towards making that change. So that's an example that she just gave about how the left operates in terms of reality shaping. And again, as reality shapers and people that see themselves in power, that's why Donald Trump is such a threat to them. It isn't a threat to them politically, because who cares? In 4 years, after 4, maybe 8 years for sure, he's gone. He's going to be termed out, and it's going to be up to somebody else. They're going to have another shot at it, and in the meantime, they're going to have other elections to contend with and to help shape the body politic in this country. What bothers them is the idea they think that they actually have the power to shape reality, to do it with words and actions, and primarily with psychology. And that's what they really replace the church with. They replace the church with psychology and things psychological. As far as having gays, and I think she's actually right on about this, where she's saying that the Catholic Church was trying to appease its critics and ended up getting itself into trouble, and is still trying to appease the critics. And it's not so much because of gays specifically, but in general, in the broadest sense, that the church is getting away from its mission of saving people's souls. That's the mission of the church. That's what it's here to do. It is here to look after my immortal soul. It is not to be worldly. It is not to give me advice on how to vote. It is not to give me advice on who to be friends with. It is not to give me advice on international trade or poverty or anything else. It is basically here to give me advice on how to save my immortal soul. And the church is getting farther and farther away from that. The Pope that's in there right now is probably as far away from, is more worldly in what he talks about and what he preaches than any other pope that I've grown up with. Certainly since the popes of, say, the Middle Ages, who again were didn't see death as a big deal or as a big problem. That the big problem or the big issue was where your soul was going after you died. That again, worldly things, even as fundamental as life and death, were not the point for the church, but that the church has over the years become more and more secular and more worldly, and have done so because the one criticism that they haven't been able to answer, the one psychological attack, is relevance, the issue of relevance, and that the left has been hammering the church by suggesting that the church is irrelevant. But then again, this is the way the left always operates. It's going to be in charge. They're going to be the leaders. They're going to be the arbiters of what it is that's relevant or irrelevant. And it is up to the rest of us to simply fall in line. So what can the average Catholic do? Ignore it. Ignore the people that are not in charge, the Mr. Kellers. He's not only a lapsed Catholic, even if he wasn't a lapsed Catholic, an apostate, even if he was going to church every week or whatnot, it's not his job to instruct everybody else on how to be a good Catholic. It is not up to him. And also, this is, again, one of the things the left likes to do, and what I like to say whenever somebody says to me, like Mr. Keller, that, hey, basically what he's telling the church is you're not being very good Catholics, and you're not being very good Christians. This is from a man who is, now he describes as a collapsed Catholic because he doesn't have the guts to come out and say what he really is. That's an atheist. Okay? He's an atheist. What that means is that he's going to hell. Okay? Which means, why do I want to take Christianity lessons from an atheist? I don't. Okay? But when you do that, when you take Christianity lessons from an atheist, surprise, surprise, when you find that you are have gone astray, that pretty soon maybe you're out cheating on your wife, and you're not living a very good life, and you're also going to be lost spiritually. You lose that sense of what is the sense of wonder in the world and in the universe, and that sense of contentment and happiness that you used to have when you were in the church, and the sense of peace and tranquility, knowing that that there's justice in the universe, ultimate justice, if not justice here on earth, and everything that the church brings to the individual, you're going to end up missing because you're taking your cues, your leadership cues, from the wrong people. If you have doubts, and again, this is where the Pope is going wrong, is that he's becoming as much of an apostate as Mr. Keller. And so when in doubt, check with the Bible. Get with the New Testament, read the New Testament, and it will help to get you back on track. Okay, so when we come back, David Horowitz and the Black Book of the American Left. Thank you very much. David Horowitz, another good, excellent writer, because he, like Tammy Bruce, has a real understanding of what it is that makes the left tick, what's going on inside their skulls, what they think, how they act, why they do what they do. You'll hear Rush Limbaugh say, "Oh, I know the left like every square inch of my glorious naked body." No, he doesn't. Okay, listen to Rush Limbaugh, read David Horowitz, read and or listen to Tammy Bruce, because she has a radio show. And then see if I'm not correct, that Rush Limbaugh, compared to these two individuals, has no clue what's going on the left. So we're at the Black Book of the American Left, and this is the first volume. He's got like 5 or 6 volumes of it. And we're at chapter 11, called The End of Time. And in chapter 10, he was dealing with the Vietnam War, and the effect of how the left was using the Vietnam War to basically advance its agenda. The End of Time. I have just published a new book, The End of Time, which is different from my other books. In the first place, its subject is different, although I have written a memoir, Radical Son, and this is something of a memoir as well. In the second place, its authorial voice is different. I've been engaged in the political wars for so long that people perceive me as someone perpetually in combat. Like most perceptions, this is only partially correct. I actually have a soft side and a reflective one. This is a book of lessons about life from one man's perspective. Life. I didn't see it coming. That is a theme of this book. In fact, none of us sees it coming when we start out on our journeys. That is one of the paradoxes of our existence. We are all so different and unique. And yet, in several crucial ways, we are the same. And this is one of them. None of us sees life coming. Or, as the Christian Testament puts it, we see now through a glass darkly, not face to face. My book is a kind of letter to the young about what I've seen, about what to expect, and it's a consolation for the old, in the sense that it is about what all of us go through. More than 300 years ago, a great scientist, Catholic philosopher, and a poet of the soul named Blaise Pascal outlined a predicament. When he died at the youthful age of 39, Pascal left a collection of notes that he had stitched together with needle and thread, and which were published after his death. Known as the Pensies, they have become a classic of Western thought. This is the fragment numbered 205. When I considered the short duration of my life, swallowed up in the eternity before and after, engulfed in the infinite immensity of spaces of which I am ignorant and which know me not, I am frightened and astonished at being here rather than there. For there is no reason why here rather than there, why now rather than then. Who has put me here? For mortals like us there is no answer. In the words of St. John, believers and non-believers stand in the same darkness. Neither sees God. Pascal was one of the greatest scientific minds that ever lived. He looked into the eye of the universe and could not find an answer. Without a creator to make sense of it, he wrote, a human life is intolerable. What then are we to do? Pascal's answer to this question was his famous wager. Pascal was a physical scientist and also a mathematician who pioneered in the field of probability theory, devising formulas to calculate the odds of winning at games of chance. Look on life, he said, as a game of chance. If you wager that there is a God who will make sense of all this, who will give meaning to our lives, who will provide us with a home in this infinite expanse of unexplored space, then there are two possibilities. If there is God, you win. If there is no God, then you have lost nothing by wagering that he exists. Therefore, wager that there is a God and that life has a meaning. I am an agnostic. I do not know if there is a God or not, but I've lived my life as if what I do has meaning, and therefore I have, in a way, taken Pascal's advice. As an agnostic, I've also seen that there are ways of believing and of demanding meanings from life that are destructive and that are the source of great human suffering and grief. Part of my book is about death and how death affects the lives we live. We live a great deal of our lives in denial of our end, as though we will go on forever. At least young people do. When you get to my age, you can see the horizon coming. Or rather, you can't avoid seeing the horizon coming. This denial and its impact on the purposes to which we devote ourselves informs the title of my book, The End of Time. This title has two meanings. First, our time has an end. And second, knowledge of this fact should shape our ends. In my book, I refer to a story by Saul Bellow that provides an image for this denial. When there's too much going on, Bellow writes, more than you can bear, you may choose to assume that nothing in particular is happening, that your life is going round and round like a turntable. Bellow doesn't say whether this is a turntable like the ones you find in playgrounds or a turntable like those on which we used to play our music on vinyl records, which are gone now like so much else. Perhaps the denial Bellow is referring to is larger than the moment itself. Perhaps he is hinting that the music of your days can lull you into an illusion that the present will go on and will never go anywhere else. Or perhaps more simply that your life is in motion when you think you are just standing still. That is, until something happens, until you get clobbered by events and wake up to the fact that the stillness is an illusion, that everything is changing about you, and that one day it will come to an end. Bellow's own clobbering was the death of his mother from cancer when he was 17. On the day this story takes place, the young Bellow, who works for a local florist, is sent to deliver flowers to the funeral of a 15-year-old girl. Disoriented by the experience, he goes to his uncle's office for comfort, but his uncle isn't in, and while the young man is in the building, he encounters a sexual mystery woman. The woman lures him to an apartment where she induces him to undress and then steals his money and clothes. The humiliated youngster is forced to return home in a dress he has found in her closet. As he approaches his house, he fears his father's wrath, but then he remembers what's on his turntable. His mother is dying. Ironically, remembering this produces in him immediate feelings of relief. He realizes that if his father's angry when he enters the door, it will mean his mother is still alive. This is how Bellow describes the experience of his mother's death. One day you are aware that what you took to be a turntable, smooth, flat, and even, was in fact a whirlpool, a vortex. The vortex of his mother's death sucked some part of Saul Bellow beneath the surface, and it never came back. My life was never the same after my mother died, Bellow said long after the event. In the story he wrote, quote, I knew she was dying and didn't allow myself to think about it. There's your turntable, unquote. There are all kinds of turntables that draw us into life and lead us to think it will go on without end. When I was in my 50s, I fell in love with a younger woman who came to me in an unexpected blessing in middle age. Her name is April, and this romance, which blossomed into marriage, became for me a new lease on life. I bought a new house for us. It was perched like an eyrie on the Palisades overlooking the Pacific. Because it cost more than my previous house, I applied for a new insurance policy that would cover the mortgage for my wife in the event of my death. I had to take a series of medical tests to qualify for the insurance. When they were completed, the company told me my application was rejected because I had a PSA of 6. PSA is an acronym for prostate-specific antigen. It is a number that can indicate the presence of a prostate cancer, so common in men that it's almost a feature of age. I didn't believe the test result. I had just had a checkup a few months earlier. My PSA was only 4. How could it have gone up so fast? Moreover, friends of mine had PSAs of 9 and no cancer. I demanded another test, which came back with a similar score. I was still unconvinced. You could call this my turntable. As soon as I expected to get cancer in this life as to go on a voyage to the moon, I had called my doctor and he ordered a biopsy. The biopsy showed that I did have prostate cancer. Obviously, I hadn't paid much attention to things like cancer, to my body for that matter. Some of us are obsessed with our bodies and their care and feeding. Others live in their heads and consider time spent on their bodies as frivolous. It's funny how we all have these gravities of our being that determine who and what we are in such fundamental ways, yet hardly think about them or how we came to have them in the first place. Some of us are optimists and expect good things to happen to us and are surprised when they don't. Others are pessimists who expect the worst and are pleasantly surprised when things turn out well. Obviously, I was an optimist and a cockeyed one at that. 3 weeks later, I went into the hospital and had my prostate removed. I was lucky. I had a brilliant surgeon, and with a little radiation afterward, I was cancer-free. Day in and day out during my illness, my wife prayed for me. She prayed for my health and for my continued presence on this earth. Her brother Joe and his wife Marta, who attended a Catholic church, organized 30 Hispanic men, women, and children, including my nieces, to pray for me too. There were others. Every morning these relatives and strangers whispered my name in their intimate conversations with God and implored him to spare me. I was touched and strengthened by their love and by their answered prayers. I had been saved and was grateful for that. I would be able to share my life with April again, to be with my children and grandchildren, to rise in the morning and greet the sea. Was God really behind this good fortune? Had he intervened to rescue an agnostic soul as a reward to the believers? Thankful as I was for their concern, I didn't like to think so. For if he had saved me to answer their prayers, then I also have to hold him responsible for the others, the ones whose prayers went unheard. One of the patients who came regularly to the cancer ward at my appointed time was a young woman who seemed to be in her 20s. She came in a wheelchair accompanied by a sad woman who appeared to be her mother and who had pushed her to the clinic from one of the recesses of the vast hospital complex we were part of. She had barely begun life, but her eyes had already traveled to a distant space, displaying a vacancy that could have been equally the result of medications or resignation. For her, this life had become a waiting room from which there was no exit. I could not help thinking each time I saw her of the many lives I had been privileged to live in my span, of those she would not. I was acutely conscious of the inhabitants of the cancer ward whose prospects were worse than mine. Along with those who loved them, they had endured multiple operations, multiple setbacks, years of a crippled existence, and a fate on hold. Life is a hospital, the poet T.S. Eliot wrote. I could appreciate the metaphorical truth in the image, but it still felt like a violence to the reality that confronted me. Not all life's hospitals were equal, and not all God's children were saved. So this not the end of the chapter, but just we're going to pause it there, let's say. But I love this because, again, it's deep. It's got a lot of depth. Not only do David Horowitz and Tammy Bruce are they able to get inside the heads of the left, but what they have to say is rich and deep. And so much what you hear today, whether it is the pundits, Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity et al., or the news, or what's going on when you hear from the senators that are doing the Kavanaugh hearing, is shallow, incredibly shallow. And what's going on with Kavanaugh right now is incredibly shallow. There's absolutely no depth to that whatsoever. So it's really refreshing and inspiring to read, even though this is getting into a very heavy subject. It's really good to read something of depth that's not just as deep as a mud puddle. So, in any case, that brings us to the conclusion of another episode of The Drill. And until next time, thank you very much for listening and have a great day.